All right. Good morning from Texas. Good afternoon in Finland. We're here with Lawson Stapleton, good friend of mine for a couple of years now. And Lawson, we're going to be talking about AI for Indigenous languages, a super interesting topic that you're passionate about. And why don't you give us a quick background of who you are and why we're here?
Sure. To be honest, no one important, but I do have a passion for this. I grew up basically in between Adelaide and Alice Springs, so there's a higher density of Indigenous communities in there compared to, say, the East Coast, where most people are familiar with Australia, with Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. So I had quite a blessed childhood of growing up between the West, I guess you could say, and the Indigenous world. And then it really fired up when I was working in the LSP industry in Adelaide. And so about 8 years, my core goal and triumph was to build the biggest Indigenous interpreting basically wing for the country. And it went huge. So yeah, that's where it came from. And now that we have AI here, knowing what I've been through and experienced firsthand, I think we have a revolutionary ticket. And I don't mean that for hype, but I genuinely think we do.
Yeah, not a lot of people are aware of how many indigenous languages there are worldwide. Did you have some stats for us that you can share that can kind of help
Yeah,
us center the argument a little bit?
sure. So generally, statistics will tell you overall there's about 6,900 to 7,500 languages in the world. About 3,100 of those would be considered endangered, and unfortunately, Indigenous, regardless of health but population size, they will be in the endangered section, unfortunately going on to the extinct way. So Canada, I could say there's about 70 out of about 450 post-colonial era. Australia, there's probably very arguable between 60 and 100 now, compared to about 400 or 500 argued post-colonial era. So it's a very small portion, and they are also categorized usually with the languages that are under-resourced, which is a whole other conversation to have.
Uh, and the reason that we got to talking about this topic is because you originally had scheduled a presentation about this that you shared
Yeah.
graciously with me. Um, I I I want to know from you, what role do you think LSPs can play in revitalizing indigenous minority languages beyond just doing the regular translation work?
That's that's such a good and big question. I think LSPs have a real future in this space, not only because of their expertise and demonstrated history, but because this space needs a mediator. So we have the Indigenous community on one hand, we have the government on the other hand. We have a long history of, I would say, mistrust and prior initiatives that didn't work. And it requires a third party that has the expertise and ability to also balance between culture, to sort of soften one another, to get them to the table to talk and reason with one another. So I would say that's a big part of it. And then I would say after that, probably bringing in specifically resources, a bit like you've mentioned with LangOps, sort of revolutionizing or next steps of translation management systems and workflows, but also with our expertise, moving into an area that is a little more hands-on with the linguists, not in a traditional way. Per se, that we do it where we take a project, we pass it, we get it back. With the Indigenous communities, it's a little more hands-on. So, in short, to answer the question.
Yeah. And I think it's probably very important for different groups that are engaging in this type of activity to collaborate across governments and language communities and service
Mm.
provider. That's pretty rare. Why is it so difficult for these groups to work together despite shared goals and maybe available funding?
It's another really good question. I would say it really depends on the government, because most of this is happening in post-colonial nations. So I think that there is a lot of collaboration, but I think that often the Indigenous language projects or incentives to do projects just fall into a generic department that's not specialized, equipped, or has the knowledge. And it's not in a disrespectful way to that department, but for example, you might have the Department of Languages that are used to immigrant languages, a little more vanilla, if you will, English to German, Japanese, and they work in a particular way. So Indigenous languages fall into an unknown and fall into the cracks. So I think it becomes too hard for them to do. But I think for living languages, I would say that they need to be separated. So as mentioned, we have the migrant languages and we'd have Indigenous languages. I think they need to be put in the right department with the right team, which is where the LSP could come in instead of the government trying to organize itself. And for that, because it's left to a generic department, is another reason why I would move on. There's only so much they can do with the bureaucracy that they have, and there's only so quickly they can move processes and projects. So basically, I think that's one of the main reasons. But I also think that one of the rarities in it as well is that most language service providers that I've come across, which is a lot, either talking to or having them come in, just don't do it. They just don't get involved with Indigenous languages, or they don't know how to do it. And they're pretty equal with that, not doing it and not knowing how to do it. So there are very, very few who are trying to do this. And I would say a rarity as well, or a reason why this sort of collaboration doesn't work, is that the government in particular works to a financial year calendar, and it doesn't bend the knee, so to speak. So I think that the way that the government institute wants to work, the way that the community wants to work, and the way that an LSP wants to work, it's not a perfect line. There's a lot of bending back and forth. And going back to an LSP, it's the perfect mediator to bring that together. But as mentioned, there are not many LSPs doing it.
Sometimes the expertise just isn't there, though. I can tell you, I did one project a number of years ago that's legendary in my mind. It's a Navajo project.
Okay, cool.
And I wanted to tell you about this so bad, so I'm gonna take 50 seconds to tell you this story, because we had a Navajo project for the government for a census, and we tracked down one of the three people in the United States that actually writes Navajo. That kind of gives you an idea of the
Sounds
complexity of
familiar.
that type of
Yeah.
that type of thing. And I was finally super excited to be able to go back to my client and say, we have somebody that can help us out with this. And then I signed the project, and there was like a 3 week silence, and I went nuts because I could not get back in touch with this person. Turns out
Yep.
that they went off the reservation literally,
Yeah.
and they were off the grid for 3 weeks. And when they came back, they were like, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I didn't have any email or internet
Yeah.
connection." This is a couple of years ago, too. This is not like now. It would be easier, I would think, but that was a nightmare because my client kept on asking, "Where's the project?" And I kept on saying, "Well, the one person that can do it is not reachable, and I don't know what to tell you." We eventually got it done, but it had some logistical problems. In your view, though, what are the most critical gaps in expertise that prevents the partnerships from succeeding, other than lack of resources sometimes,
Nice.
in the case that I just outlined?
So I think that the critical gaps in expertise, I think it's the disconnection of people and expectations. So sort of you made a really good example then and there where there's a demand. We want to work with this community. And we expect in sort of the Western calendar, it will be done in X amount of time. And that includes, the scope, the timeline, the pricing, everything. But then I think there's more of a need in those situations for a holistic consultation where someone has to be able to navigate the government through their actual abilities and through the bureaucracy, as they can only do so much at a certain pace. But while someone also needs to ensure that the Indigenous population is well represented and heard and consulted and given a reasonable and sort of cultural accommodating schedule, someone also needs to be pulling both sides together to find that happy medium. And that's something that in my endeavors happened all the time for me, but most other LSPs didn't do that. It became too hard. So I would say also that the technological or technology expertise and its connections are lost in these gaps. So an LSP has all these tools now, and they're growing and growing. Like I think you've mentioned a few times, tongue in cheek, like there's always an added feature coming. Like it's just constantly coming. But in saying that, the expectation was also that all people would have that. And something that you've also been a really good advocate at is the democratization of these tools. And
Yeah.
up until recently, and even now, a lot of these Indigenous communities don't have access, or haven't been given the opportunity to see how something would work or how it's used, and it's just often assumed. So governments, on the other hand, are so big that um, they often don't know how or what they have. So they're almost similar in the same space of they're assuming one another has something, but they don't have something. And so it becomes a little bit difficult with measuring these gaps and finding out. But I think ironically, one of the biggest critical gaps is actually cultural navigation. I think this is where the linguist and the LSP need to be left to their own devices without too much intervention. Where a government, as mentioned before, will say, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they interfere in the project and put more pressure on or more expectations. And it just doesn't work. And we found the more rigid it became, the more it was likely to snap. So I think that's sort of the gap. So communication, cultural understanding, technology, and just reasonable expectations, to be honest.
Yeah. One of the things that I really like about you is that you're not under the surface. You really go deep on some of these subjects and get, you're kind of I can identify with that. I like to find out a lot more than just under the surface of any topic that I want to talk about. And recently, I know you've done some research on Canada. Maybe we can talk about that for a minute as a
Sure.
microcosm of global language loss, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think we can learn from the decline in indigenous languages and indigenous language speakers in Canada? Despite Canada being pretty good about legal mandates and funding for language presentation, I think they have a new regulation coming out in Quebec here in the next coming months as well. So anyway, that's my question. Let's talk about
It's
Canada for a second.
Canada's interesting. I mean, under the Trudeau government, up
Hmm.
until 2000, between 2020 and 2024, they had a staggered uh, budget that went up and up and up. And so 2024, it ended with $250 million Canadian dollars in language revitalization funding in Indigenous affairs. Um, so the incentives there, the money's there, but I think putting that into learning outright lessons, I think the decline of these Indigenous languages is a total loss of knowledge and a way of life. In that it's an irony that we live in a period where we have massive environmental concerns and we have all of a sudden this revitalization as well, where we want to find out what is the most sustainable way of farming, what's the most sustainable way of fishing, all these sorts of things. And so it's kind of an irony that these lands from the industrial period through colonization are farmed and harvested in a way that is always been known since the Industrial Revolution. But now there's all these inquiries into local Indigenous communities on, hang on a second, how did you make things sustainable? Because Indigenous communities are well known for being able to continuously source something in a very friendly way. And so, interestingly enough, there was actually a book released maybe 5, 6 years ago. Someone will correct me on this. It's called Duck Emu by Bruce Pacot. And basically, he made the argument of maybe we should just wait with our environmental policies and talk to the Indigenous. And his main arguments were, for example, the sustainability of fauna, flora, or the vegetation or the environment. And for example, it's a controlled burn off. And they actually did science experiments or environmental experiments on a harvested renewal of greenery versus a controlled burn off. And the controlled burn off produced more flora fauna than the like Western way, so to speak. And they also found it with cattle, where they were sort of comparing hoof to soft paw and how it deteriorated soil. So there's all these like little lessons that are in there. But I think also what's important is the loss of historical accounts, two sides of a story. And also what I think is really a big lesson is how we learn. What kind of style learning we are, because in the Western world, we're so used to reading and writing. Everything is about reading and writing. And there are millions of people that are not good at reading and writing. But if you go into an Indigenous community, it's about storytelling, it's about conveying, it's about kinesthetics. And if we took lessons from that, we could change our learning styles and maybe we could be even better. And now learning styles are becoming more highlighted and popular. So I think that's sort of some of the biggest lessons, I think, in a nutshell.
And there's some surprising things that you found out, I think, too, about Canadian Indigenous languages, and in particular how there's more second language learners all of a
Yeah,
sudden now for those communities. Does that trend give you hope?
it does because I think we've been through a dark period where we say Aboriginality or Indigenousness has been sort of what we say demonized for a prolonged period where there were say efforts by the West to incorporate Indigenous people into Western society and it didn't go very well. There's a long list of those things, but for example, the boarding houses in Canada, um, very sensitive topic. But
Yeah.
um, now, because there's sort of been a recognition of, okay, we did some bad things, we need to make up for this. I think there is more of a, dare I say, safe space now to be Aboriginal or to be Indigenous. And so I think it was from the 2020 or 2021 consensus, there was a general Indigenous languages one, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The numbers have hugely spiked, and this is during COVID. And I think because it's recognized and given the space now, there are those who have been too afraid to engage in their heritage and now going back and engaging in it. So it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, and some of the languages showing growth, others not so much. Do you have any particular reason you think why languages like Haisla or Mischief show so much growth and others not?
Yeah, I mean, each I think has I mean, generally there is now funding and recognition. So I think that's the core. And then after that, I think it's down to the individuality of each community. So with Machif or Machif, I'll pronounce it incorrectly. I still struggle with
I'm
all their
glad you're
names.
struggling with it because I
Yeah,
wasn't 100% sure that I was saying it correctly either.
yeah,
So I'm now absolved, I hope.
it's how do I say that it's a hybrid language between an indigenous language and French, and so there's a very
Uh,
strong European background, and so I think because of that, the geography, the resource, the heritage, I think there is a stronger position to fight for it, and it's a larger number. Whereas Heisler is an extreme version on the brink that is making its way back. If anything, I think this could be one of the success stories where you've only got about 200 people who are speaking that language that are a little bit older, but they've been able to put it back in the school or into a local community school and to teach. But that's in British Columbia, and I believe that British Columbia has the highest density of revitalization language programs in Canada. So it's a good example for the rest.
yeah. And you touched upon this already, but how do you think storytelling and land acknowledgement can be woven into to language work to strengthen both the cultural identity and the linguistic community?
I would say both storytelling and land acknowledgement carry insights to benefit our lives greatly. I think storytelling provides a different perspective, rationale, and reasoning, and it's engaging. You know, people are going to gather around and listen to what's being said. So I think this is good for understanding the culture and say working relations, but also something mutually problematic. But I think some languages ingrain such a strong thought process into the language that it can't be divided. So it's sort of they go hand in hand with each other, I think. It's it's a really good question, but I think storytelling is also something that's on a decline. And I think this is something that also makes it special or a revitalization that people will look at and go, oh yeah, we used to tell stories too, or whatever it is. Let's look at the indigenous. How do they do it? How is this something that we can learn from them? So
Yeah. We we're coming to the part of the interview that I'm being drawn in a bit more because we haven't really talked about technology, but we're about to
ah
touch upon it now because that's
yeah, yeah.
the correlation between your passion topic and my passion topic, so to speak. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunity that AI presents for workflows for low resource languages. I think you've outlined a six-step process for supporting minority languages with
Hmm.
AI. Uh, where do most projects fail or stall, and
Yeah.
how could we get organized to help indigenous languages with AI, you think?
So this is actually probably one of the funnest parts, I think, and it gets me really excited because it amalgamates so many things like our passions, but also hope and abilities, and we can actually do something here. So the 6 steps that I arranged, and I work with a friend of mine who's an AI engineer to
Mm,
just sort of keep me in check. But the first step is establishment. So what model and API hosting are we looking at? What are the capabilities? Is it the right, model for us? What would the hindrance be? Because nothing is perfect, but we need the best of what we can do. And then obviously secure storage and if there's a regional obligation, because if you're working with say Canada or Australia or Papua New Guinea, there is an element of we want to own the language still with the indigenous community, so working with government. So it's a consideration. I would say data acquisition. This is probably where you're going to trump me, but data acquisition where sort of raw textual data, making sure it's legal and what's questionable, speech to text if it's available, and then I would say the digitalization or the OCR scanning of all these text documents, and establishing the user case and test. So a really interesting examples or modern examples of data acquisition in the revitalization era, I would say would be, I mean, the original gangster of this would be Hebrew with the Hebrew revitalization of the 1880s to the 1940s. And then I would say Hawaiian and Maori in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then in my hometown, there's Ghana. So in Adelaide, South Australia, where they've had to go through, say, all these sorts of documents that are old school, so to speak. So a lot of fine combing through the data, and a lot of it's biblical or ye olde speech. So then that goes into the next part, which is the sort of digitalization or the modernization of that text, which a lot of people are using Bibles. Well, a lot of people, the small group of people that are working in this area are using Bibles. So if you take the New and Old King James Testament, you're talking what, 798,000 words, and the average English sentence is 7 to 8 words. So we're talking about 100,000 sentences out of that source alone. So people are using that. That's what they did with Hebrew. So it's a bit of inspiration. And then you obviously have other things like government notices, government paraphernalia that over the years that you can collect. But then it needs to be modernized. So you need someone to come in and go, hey, this is a bit too gaudy, or this is a bit too old school. And then I'd say the fourth step is data validation. So acquisition, validation, preparation, and enrichment. So data restructuring, and you will know more than me, but this is sort of where RAG application would jump in. And then I would say, if depending on what the process is or how you want to go, but I would say data restructuring for the model, and a bit of fine tuning. Well, a fair bit of fine tuning. And then that's where the Indigenous specific consultation would come in, because there are some things that can be said and there are some things that can't be said. And also just to, I would say in this instance, a back translation, putting it back and forth just to make sure that the languages can go both ways, whether it's conversational or translatable. And then the last part is build and test. But your question on where do they fail? Probably in all 6 steps. I mean, I've heard of people defining endangered languages as under-resourced languages and vice versa. So often the model is either too big or too small. I think data acquisition, people don't know where to look. They give up. The digitalization or the modernization, that's really hard because you need to have the linguist. It's not something you can do alone. So we have good relations. We can talk to our fellow linguists and say, hey, what do you think? People don't have that. They're looking constantly. And then the data validation, if people get that far, to be
Yeah.
honest.
I think it's super interesting that the Bible's involved with this. Who would have thought it?
Yeah,
And that there's a precedent, like you said, with Hebrew on revitalizing the language through the footprint of the Bible. Very interesting. I had no idea about that.
yeah,
And
it's
that's go ahead.
no, sorry, I cut you off. You go.
No, no. So I mean, from my perspective, probably where you have the biggest challenge, I would think, is with data gathering for a language that might just lack the written resources. What innovative approaches do you take in that case, you think?
So this is a super cool question. Um, Gathering data. Data is one of the beautiful things is that most organized governments have the money to look after Indigenous, well, what would you say? Indigenous data is very general, but I would say that there are usually now Indigenous national archives in these sort of post-colonial countries, whether it's South Africa or whether it's Australia, New Zealand. And there is just pages and pages and pages of whatever scripts. And the thing that they all have in common is it all comes back from the missionaries. It is mostly biblical, but you do have the part, I don't know, the Jesuits, the evangelicals, the Catholics, they would go out usually because the monarch would send them to build relations and build rapport and build language skills. And it goes down that way. But what most people don't realize is that it outside of the biblical part, they were also translating all of the communications for everything else. And that could have been, we need food supplies, we need building materials. These are the logistics for something. So there's all of that as well in these archives, all of it. So basically what we can do is we can take that, we can use an OCR scanner now. And what would have taken probably, I think you could put as many years on it as you want, to go through and convert from paper to
Yeah.
the digital world. In most cases, I would say that the part is the syllabic systems, but that's another story. You almost instantly now. And these OCR scanners are available nearly I mean, Adobe has one,
Yeah.
Google has one. So you can just suck that data out straight away. So that's an area that I think we can really move into. And I think on the syllabics, though, it's also an opportunity for us to reset some of these systems. So, for example, in Australia, if I look at the Bidinjara Yankunytjatjara language, it's in an English evangelical syllable set. So even in the articulation of it, I can get it as a native English speaker. But if I go to the Yornumara language of Jamabanyu, it's Dutch. I can't pronounce the phonetics of the Dutch. So
Ik kan dat wel doen natuurlijk. Bij mij zou dat geen probleem zijn. You need me for that project.
yeah, we do. Come on down. But so I think it's an opportunity to sort of redefine the phonetics as well and how we use those syllabic systems, because there are fortunate examples where they have say an English syllabic system. There are other languages like Cree, for example, in Canada, say Plains Cree, Moose Cree. There's many dialects of Cree. You're talking about 60,000 people in general. They have a symbol syllabics, and I'm not sure how that would go. That could perhaps stall a project for a long period. But I think what's really interesting is the way that we're moving into speech to text now. They're widely available. They're in a hot space for research and development. There is flexibility in them. So I think audio signal processing and machine learning would be obviously very pivotal in this. And if we get the syllabics right, I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't do that. I think the irony is it would have to be the English pronunciation articulation, because all of this new wave tech is dominated. I think it's 70% now, 75% is trained in English. So if this is to be universal and as accessible as possible, these are little things that we need to look out for. So yeah.
I'm not letting you off the hook this easy, because I just get the impression that you have really practical, specific experience. So, can you share a specific or real or hypothetical example where this
Yeah.
step-by-step approach could work for a specific language, indigenous language?
Yeah. So how do I set this up? So after hours, outside in my private time, a friend of mine, the AI engineer, we did a little test using the same information I've mentioned before, where we found in this the language is Yamplatok. Yamplatok is a language between the top of Queensland going into Papua New Guinea, and there's these islands called the Torres Strait. It's Australia for you. Torres is actually the name of the ship that a Spanish explorer went through. And the language is affected by French after the 7-Year War, when the French went down to Polynesia. Anyway.
Je pourrais aider avec celui-là aussi, il n'y a pas de problème, je parle français aussi. Just just offering you my services if I can be of any help in that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you gotta
Yes.
hurry up and come down. We don't pay as well as the Saudi Arabian gig, but but um, but basically, it's what I would consider a Goldilocks language. So we're looking at about 30,000 people. We are looking at a controlled area. We are looking at good, what would we say, good infrastructure. There is budget, there is a need, but the problem that they have is out of the 30,000 plus, because something I should mention about that area is that there is a legal sovereignty of the area as they're Melanesian people. So there's free flow between Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. So the population can fluctuate a bit, and I won't get into the statistics because I'll divert everything. But long story short, if there's 30,000 people, there are 6 registered certified interpreters and translators for the entire population. So it's like 0.0002% to look at it. It's not manageable.
Yeah.
So if you want to go to the hospital, the courts, employment, or anything like that, Australia's go-to language is English. So you have 30,000 people, 6 people to look after them. It's not going to happen. So if we were to roll out a small language model that is just say conversational, that could be deployed into a hospital, into employment services or whatever, to do the minor stuff. You go to an employment appointment to check in, how many jobs have you done? Okay, what's the status? Okay, great. You can go. It's 10 minutes, right? You don't need an hour booking. You go to the hospitals and emergency side A, you're in real trouble. Emergency side B, I've just come here because I can't go to a doctor or something like that. It's non-urgent. You could self-check yourself in using this conversational small language model. And same with the courts. If you had to go for a court matter, you could self-register yourself. So I think that something like a small language model would be a perfect hybrid in that it would allow the linguists to basically apply themselves to what they like. So there's more pleasure in what they do. It would free them up for more important matters. And the small language model that's deployed could then take care of the more monotonous, boring stuff to help prioritize matters. So that's an example of what we've done. And there have been talks with the government rolling these things out, and it's in high consideration. But as you know, governments move slowly. So
Yeah. And you touched upon a technical detail that caught my attention there. Small language models. We often talk about large language models.
yeah.
What's the reason that we're thinking small here? Is it because of the data limitations or?
I'm thinking, so really the competition is a large language model, neural machine translation, and say a small language model. I just think that we're running into a time where we have a couple of issues. One is we're leaving languages behind, and I think there are languages or a contingent that can be saved, and there are some unfortunately that are not going to make it. But using a small language model, we would be able to create a conversational, searchable, translatable, mechanism that would not only sort of preserve the language, would contribute to the language, would create huge amounts of access and put people back into the world pipeline. It's also something that can be used by the community itself as a sense of empowerment. So I think in that instance, it's really powerful. But on a more technical side, small language models are significantly cheaper to run. They are designed for more specific matters. So you need a smaller pool of data to create more specific tasks. So that's a large language model out. And then with neural machine translator, the transformer architecture is just for one thing. It's just to translate. So we could do everything in one go with this. And I think now is a prime time, in my opinion.
Yeah. I would think that in some of these indigenous communities, internet access might be a challenge. Is that right? Is that a
Yeah.
complication that you deal with?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, local hosting and offline use of, let's say, an Indigenous SLM would be totally pivotal to the success of it, because you're right, the network and infrastructure in a lot of communities either doesn't exist or it's really unreliable. There's no question about it. So, and also with these small language models, you can operate offline, which is a good point to bring up as well. So it can not only function, but can also be worked on at the same time, which is another main point. So yeah, good point.
Yeah, let's talk a minute about the impacts and ethical implementations, the real world impact and ethical implementations of this type of initiative. What are the clearest benefits you think for the communities using small language models in the preservation efforts?
For communities, I would say centralized and accessible language access, something that hasn't happened yet. And I would say for community that it's also controllable and owned by them within community, and that it's a catalyst in speeding up for lost time in the revitalization or the preservation of their language.
Yeah. And how do we ensure that these AI tools built for minority language don't become tokenistic or extractive, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Tokenistic is the word because there has been a history of this. So I think in this space, a lot of entities simply want publicity. Governments, local councils, sort of to result in continuing good fund deeding, a good say funding deeds, so a good deed funding. Sorry, mix my words up there. So I think we want to leverage and continue the good deed allowances, but at the same time, we want to ensure that results are actually real and they're actually happening. I mean, at the moment, if we go to say Queensland, or I would say British Columbia, but more specifically Queensland, there are grants by the Queensland government of up to I think it's 40 or 60,000 per language over a year to revitalize it. So in some instances in the past, you've had the tokenistic, we've paid out the money, here you go, and then they've taken 10 languages on. Thank you very much. We'll take $600,000, and the results have been a children's book in hi, my name's Gerald, and this is my story. Is that worth $60,000 a language? I don't think so. So exactly, I think we want to leverage it, but also want to have real results. So the small language model would come in, and I think it would erase that because it would be tangible evidence of
Hmm.
productive output.
Yeah. Are there ways, I'm sure that the language community is going to be fascinated by this interview and people are going to be asking how they can support it. If I know anything about our community, what strategies do you recommend LSPs or even people that work at tech firms
Mm.
that want to support language preservation ethically? What strategies would you recommend?
Oh, that's a really good one. I think first of all, going in with an open mind and the genuine ability to be different, because learn from me. You have to definitely commit to the community. It's not about you. It's a shared goal, and it's about them. I would say learn the ways of the people, because the way that say business is done, time, values, they can be very different. Gain the trust and respect as an outsider, and you're just going to have to wait your turn until you're one of the people. And I know this sounds a little bit Star Wars-ish, but I really mean this. And then you have to consult on everything from start to finish and have patience. If you don't consult with the group on all things, nothing will happen, or you're going to get in trouble and pay for it later on. I would say, despite the community being the one in need, they will have their own perceptions of what should be done, and this voice should be given a space because they're the ones who have the real problem. They have been thinking about it a long time, but they haven't had a platform to be heard. To be honest, so we also must remember there's often a lot of mistrust. Just saying, because of previous, I would say, Western initiatives in the past where community has been either ill or underserved, and it's happened a lot. So that's part of the patience in the process, in that we have to understand that people have gone before with other things, but the community has been left scarred. And so we have to inherit that, unfortunately, and we have to earn our stripes. So patience, be genuine, build proper relations. It's going to take time, consult.
Yeah. Last week, I wrote an article about pricing, or I did a post on LinkedIn about pricing that caused a lot of interaction and conversation online. So I thought we'd turn to that for just a second here
Right.
too. How do you reinvent the pricing and funding models to reflect the complexity and long-term nature of the revitalization work that we're
Well,
talking about?
I can tell you 8 years of doing it, it was completely different. So with the Indigenous, it was an hourly rate or a project rate, or it was
Yeah.
employment. So there were no fuzzies because work done is work done. So that was out, and there's a huge amount of time because with these languages, you have what is it, aetiological explanation, and aetiological is a term that's usually used in, say, mythology or archaeology, where an explanation is explained, but it might not be scientific. So when there's a concept that is in English or, say, a European language, even into, say, some Asian languages, the concept doesn't exist. So it's not necessarily Indigenous, but Indigenous just tends to be a little more extreme with the gaps. So if we're talking about court, going to the court, it's a completely different process to what it would be on country. Say with the Indigenous in Central Australia, chukara, which chukara is the law of the land there. So there is a lot of time for consideration, and then when there's uncertainty, there needs to be a consensus about what that concept is and what the wording could be. And then there's often a back translation. So a word rate isn't going to work here, and fuzzies are not going to work. So yeah, it's hourly, project funded, or employment. No question about it. And with these small language models, if we were to get linguists to work in these small language models, it would be that way as well. So
What does success look like, Lawson, in this case? What are you most proud of so far in these kind of initiatives?
success, so many. I mean, I think seeing and being part of a bilingual sort of institutionalized community. So a community where you can have both your languages in university, at the bank, school, in any function. That would be the beginning. But success would also be in a very literal process. Success for a project would be that the government pays for the project, which they've already got the money for, so it's not a stopper. The LSP consults and is left to do that professional part, and then fosters relations and produces results in conjunction with the Indigenous community, who the Indigenous community then provides all the linguistic and cultural expertise. And what really excites and would be a measure of success is increasing the employment of Indigenous communities and having the money go back into that community. That would be success to me.
Yeah. Are there any specific initiatives or things that people could get involved in that you could recommend people that are maybe interested in this type of support?
Yeah, definitely. So if people have an interest in a particular Indigenous language or know of a particular Indigenous language, it's highly likely that you could Google it with language revitalization or language project, and Google will just go crazy with all of it. And it's very public. You can see, the funding, the progress, what they've done, what they want to do. You could donate, you could participate. I'm sure you could be part of it in some way or another, if welcomed, of course. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so very much for enlightening us on indigenous languages and the role technology plays in it. It's been a fascinating talk. I won't be seeing you in Montreal, but I still hope
No.
that one of these days we'll run into each other, maybe at a European conference soon. Thank you so very much, Lawson, for sharing all this very interesting information with us.
Thank you very much for everything. It's an honor. Thank you.
You're welcome.